The world, as Elias knew it, was a tapestry woven with predictable threads. Each morning the sun rose, painting the sky with familiar hues. Each evening it set, leaving behind the comforting embrace of routine. His life, a meticulous construction of quiet certainties, unfolded within this stable framework. Elias worked in a small, unassuming office, his days filled with the rhythmic click of a keyboard and the soft hum of fluorescent lights. He paid his bills on time, maintained a respectable garden, and occasionally indulged in a good book by the fireplace. Control was an illusion he cherished, a bedrock on which he'd built his modest existence. He believed in the solidity of institutions, the resilience of infrastructure, and the inherent order of things. Yet even in this meticulously ordered world, subtle fissures occasionally appeared. A fleeting news report of an unprecedented seismic event on a distant continent, quickly dismissed as an anomaly. A brief, inexplicable flicker of the city's power grid, attributed to a minor technical glitch. Elias would feel a momentary prickle of unease, a whisper of vulnerability brushed aside by the sheer weight of normalcy. These were mere blips, easily forgotten in the ceaseless churn of daily life, inconsequential footnotes in the grand, unwavering narrative of human progress. He never truly considered the possibility of a world without these anchors, a life devoid of the familiar. Then, without warning, the tapestry unraveled. It began not with a roar but with a shudder, a deep guttural tremor that resonated through the very bones of the earth, a sound that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly within the chest. Elias was at his desk, reviewing a spreadsheet, when the first violent jolt threw him from his chair. The office lights flickered wildly, then died, plunging everything into a sudden, terrifying darkness punctuated by the sickening crunch of collapsing concrete. Panic, a raw primal force, seized him. The collapse was not a singular event, but a rapid-fire succession of devastating blows. Walls imploded, windows shattered into a million glittering shards, and the once sturdy floor beneath him buckled and tore like paper. The air filled with a suffocating cocktail of dust, pulverized stone, and the metallic tang of twisted steel. Outside, through a newly created gaping hole in the wall, Elias glimpsed a landscape of utter annihilation. Buildings, once proud monuments of human ambition, now lay in jagged ruins, their skeletal remains reaching accusingly towards a sky choked with debris. The meticulously planned city grid, the familiar landmarks that had guided his entire life, were gone, swallowed by a maelstrom of destruction. Elias, scrambling amidst the rubble, felt an overwhelming wave of disbelief wash over him. His mind, accustomed to logic and order, struggled to process the sheer scale of the devastation. This couldn't be real. This was a nightmare from which he would surely awaken. But the acrid smell of smoke, the piercing screams that echoed through the dust-filled air, and the crushing weight of fallen masonry were undeniably real. His world, his entire carefully constructed reality, had crumbled into dust in a matter of terrifying moments. Disoriented and alone, Elias found himself pinned beneath a heavy beam, his leg throbbing with a searing pain. The air grew thick with the silence that followed the initial cataclysm, a silence more terrifying than the cacophony it replaced. He was trapped, utterly isolated in a landscape of ruin, the full extent of the disaster, an unfathomable horror. The ground continued to tremble faintly, a chilling reminder of the earth's raw, untamed power. He lay there, breath catching in his throat, a solitary figure in a world that had ceased to exist. What had happened? How could everything vanish so completely? The questions screamed in his mind, unanswered and terrifying. The heavy beam pressed relentlessly against Elias's leg, a constant, searing reminder of the new reality. Hours bled into an eternity. He pushed, he pulled, his muscles screaming in protest, but the weight remained immovable. Thirst gnawed at his throat, a parched desert within him, and the metallic tang of dust still clung to his tongue. When exhaustion finally forced him to cease his futile struggles, a profound silence descended, broken only by the sporadic creak of settling debris and the distant, almost ghostly wail of what he presumed to be another survivor. His immediate struggle for survival was a desperate primal dance with the cold, unyielding mechanics of the collapsed world. He eventually managed to free himself, the pain in his leg a dull throb that would become a constant companion. Limping through the labyrinth of twisted metal and shattered concrete, Elias quickly understood the brutal truth of his new existence. Scarcity. Water, once an endless tap, was now a precious, elusive commodity. Food, once a supermarket aisle away, was non-existent. Danger lurked in every shadow, not just from falling debris, but from the desperate desperation that began to manifest in the eyes of the few other survivors he encountered. These fleeting interactions were brief, wary glances, every individual a potential threat or a ghost of what humanity once was. His mind, however, often drifted back to the before. He saw his perfectly manicured lawn, the hum of his refrigerator, the comforting weight of his morning coffee mug in his hands. He remembered the mundane anxieties of quarterly reports and traffic jams, anxieties that now seemed ludicrously trivial. His wife, Sarah, her infectious laugh echoing in his memory, her gentle touch. Their small, cozy home filled with books and art, a sanctuary of peace. All of it gone. The overwhelming weight of loss settled upon him, a crushing burden heavier than any fallen beam. His family, his home, his purpose, evaporated into the dust. How quickly it vanished, he muttered to himself, his voice hoarse and unfamiliar in the vast desolation. His past certainties, the bedrock of his existence, had proven to be nothing more than sandcastles against an unforeseen tide. The steady job, the retirement plan, the carefully cultivated relationships, all rendered meaningless. This internal monologue was a constant companion, a desperate attempt to reconcile the man he was with the hollow shell he had become. Hope, once a flickering ember, was slowly being extinguished, replaced by a cold, creeping fear and an overwhelming despondency that threatened to consume him entirely. He stumbled upon a small group huddled around a meager fire, their faces etched with despair. Some stared blankly into the flames, their spirits seemingly broken, having surrendered to the inevitable. Others, their eyes burning with a fierce animalistic intensity, clutched makeshift weapons, ready to fight for whatever scraps remained. Elias observed them, a detached observer in the theater of human collapse, recognizing the spectrum of reactions to this unimaginable tragedy. He felt an acute, profound loneliness, a sense of being utterly adrift in a sea of suffering, questioning his own existence, his purpose in a world that had no use for him. As he rummaged through the debris of what might have once been a small bookstore, his fingers brushed against something soft. He pulled it out, his heart lurching. It was a well-worn leather-bound journal, Sarah's journal. Her elegant handwriting filled the pages, chronicling their life together, small joys, shared dreams, mundane observations. He found a pressed wildflower between two pages, a relic from a picnic they had shared a lifetime ago. A wave of grief, raw and agonizing, surged through him. The journal, a tangible remnant of his lost love, intensified his sorrow, turning the dull ache of loss into a sharp, unbearable agony. He clutched it to his chest, the faint scent of her perfume still clinging to the aged leather, a ghost of a memory in a world of ruins. He was truly alone. Elias, his body a symphony of aches, and his spirit a discordant dirge, stumbled onward, the weight of Sarah's journal a constant heavy presence against his chest. Each step was an effort, a testament to the sheer will to simply not cease existing. The acute agony of grief, triggered by the journal, had now morphed into a dull, throbbing exhaustion that permeated his very bones. He sought refuge, not out of hope for comfort, but from the immediate pressing danger of exposure and the ever-present threat of others. He discovered a partially collapsed basement, its entrance obscured by fallen masonry, offering a meager but essential sanctuary. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of damp earth, but it was quiet, a blessed silence after the incessant creaks and groans of the ruined city above. Here, in this temporary respite, the immediate fight for survival receded just enough for the deeper, more insidious battle to begin. The silence, rather than offering peace, amplified his inner turmoil, transforming the vast, echoing emptiness of the world outside into a cavern within his own mind. Doubt, a venomous serpent, coiled around his heart, questioning not just his survival, but the very meaning of existence itself. Why endure? Why struggle? For what purpose? The questions hammered at him, relentless and unforgiving. He had built his life on logical constructs, on tangible achievements and predictable outcomes. Now all those pillars had crumbled, leaving him adrift in a nihilistic void. He questioned the nature of good, the existence of order, and most profoundly, the concept of a benevolent higher power. If there was a God, how could such devastation be permitted? How could such suffering be inflicted? His childhood faith, once a comforting blanket woven into the fabric of his upbringing, felt like a distant, forgotten dream, a naive story from another lifetime. It was a faint whisper, barely audible over the roaring storm of his despair, yet it was there. As days bled into weeks within his subterranean haven, a subtle shift began. He noticed a persistent green shoot pushing through a crack in the concrete floor, a tenacious sprout defying the desolation. It was a tiny, insignificant detail in a world of monumental ruin, yet it caught his eye, holding his gaze with an almost magnetic force. Then, one evening, a faint rhythmic tapping echoed from somewhere above, carried by the wind through a ventilation shaft. It was not human, not mechanical, but organic, persistent, like a distant heartbeat. A seed of possibility, fragile yet resilient, began to germinate in the barren landscape of his soul. He remembered a scripture from his youth, one his grandmother used to recite. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." The words, long buried under layers of cynicism and modern pragmatism, surfaced with an unexpected clarity. He had dismissed them as poetic platitudes, but now, in the absolute dearth of anything else, they resonated with a faint, almost imperceptible warmth. He thought of his grandmother, her unwavering conviction, her quiet strength. One particularly bleak dawn, as the first grey light filtered into his makeshift shelter, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stale air, Elias made a desperate, almost involuntary act of faith. He closed his eyes, the journal clutched tightly in his hand, and without uttering a single word, without knowing if anyone or anything was listening, he simply surrendered. It was not a plea for rescue, nor a demand for answers. It was a simple, profound gesture of letting go, of acknowledging his utter helplessness, and in that raw vulnerability, offering it up to something beyond himself. He laid down the burden, not knowing if it would be lifted, but knowing he could no longer carry it alone. Elias's surrender in that bleak dawn was not born of newfound hope, but from an exhaustion so profound it transcended despair. It was a quiet, desperate letting go, a decision to trust not because logic dictated it, but because every other avenue had led only to deeper suffering. There was no grand revelation, no booming voice from the heavens, just a quiet acceptance that he could not control the chaos, and perhaps he was not meant to. His journal, now a silent confidant, held the weight of his unspoken fears and the nascent stirrings of a belief he hadn't known he still possessed. The days that followed held a subtle, almost imperceptible shift. It began with small, seemingly coincidental occurrences that, in his former life, he would have dismissed as mere chance. One afternoon, while foraging through the skeletal remains of a grocery store, he stumbled upon a sealed can of peaches, miraculously untouched by the devastation. It was a simple find, yet in a world where sustenance was a daily battle, it felt like a profound gift, appearing precisely when his hunger gnawed at him most fiercely. Another time, as a sudden, torrential downpour threatened to flood his makeshift shelter, he discovered a forgotten tarp, tucked away beneath a pile of rubble, large enough to divert the worst of the water. Each incident, isolated and minor, chipped away at his ingrained skepticism, presenting a pattern that defied pure randomness. His perspective, once rigidly anchored in the tangible, began to soften. He started to perceive a delicate, almost invisible thread weaving through the remnants of the world, connecting these small acts of grace. The persistent green shoot from the concrete floor, which he had initially dismissed as a biological anomaly, now seemed to possess a quiet resilience, a testament to life's stubborn refusal to yield. The rhythmic tapping sound he had heard earlier, which he later traced to a woodpecker relentlessly carving into a decaying tree, became a symbol of persistent effort and purpose amidst destruction. He began to see divine presence, not in grand, overt miracles, but in the mundane, in the tenacity of nature, in the unexpected survival of a single can of fruit. This nascent faith, however, was not without its internal battles. His rational mind, honed by years of scientific thought and empirical evidence, waged a relentless war against this emerging spiritual conviction. It screamed for proof, for logical explanations, for anything concrete to justify this inexplicable sense of being cared for. Yet, the quiet voice within, the one that had surfaced from his childhood memories, gently countered, reminding him that some truths transcended logic, residing instead in the realm of the heart. Driven by a nascent sense of purpose that felt alien yet compelling, Elias found himself extending a hand to others. He had always been a solitary man, but now the sight of another survivor, gaunt and despairing, stirred something within him beyond mere pity. He shared his meager findings, offered what little comfort he could, not out of a desire for reciprocation, but from a growing understanding that survival was not an individual endeavor, and that acts of kindness, however small, held an intrinsic value. He helped an elderly woman sift through the ruins of her home, not expecting to find anything of worth, but simply offering his strength. He shared his scavenged water with a feverish man, knowing it depleted his own dwindling supply. These actions, born of a quiet compassion, brought a profound sense of peace amidst the ongoing chaos, a tranquility that no amount of material security could have provided. Then one evening, as he sorted through a pile of waterlogged books salvaged from a collapsing library, his fingers brushed against something metallic. Tucked deep within the brittle pages of an old leather-bound Bible, he found a delicate silver locket. It was his grandmother's locket, one he remembered her wearing constantly, a small, unassuming piece she cherished. He had believed it lost forever. Inside, nestled behind a faded photograph of his younger self, was a tiny, intricately folded piece of paper. He unfolded it carefully, his heart thrumming with an inexplicable anticipation. On it, in his grandmother's elegant cursive hand, were the words from the same scripture that had resurfaced in his mind. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." The locket, the scripture, the timing. It was too precise, too personal to be mere coincidence. It was a direct, undeniable connection to his rediscovered faith, strengthening his resolve and cementing the belief that indeed an unseen hand was guiding him through the desolate landscape. Elias's faith, now a deeply rooted conviction, transformed from a fragile seedling into a resilient force. It no longer sought to deny the pervasive destruction, but rather transcended it, viewing the shattered world not as an end, but as a crucible for new beginnings. He began to actively seek out ways to rebuild, understanding that monumental tasks began with minuscule symbolic acts. He cleared a small patch of rubble, not for immediate use, but to mark a space where something new could eventually grow. He meticulously stacked salvaged bricks, envisioning structures that would rise from the ashes. These actions, born from an unwavering inner strength, were a quiet testament to his belief that even in desolation, hope could be cultivated. His quiet resolve did not go unnoticed. Other survivors, drawn by his steady demeanor and purposeful actions, began to gather. They saw in Elias not a leader who commanded, but one who inspired through his consistent demonstration of faith and perseverance. He became a beacon of quiet strength, his unwavering spirit a stark contrast to the despair that still clung to the ruins. Slowly, tentatively, a community began to form around him. They were a motley group, each scarred by loss, yet finding a fragile sense of belonging in their shared struggle and Elias's steadfast presence. They started to collaborate, pooling their meager resources, their collective efforts echoing Elias's individual acts of rebuilding. However, the path of reconstruction was fraught with challenges, testing Elias's newfound faith and emerging leadership at every turn. Scarcity often bred suspicion, and fear, an insidious poison, threatened to unravel their fragile unity. One particularly harsh winter, resources dwindled to critical levels. A man named Silas, whom Elias had trusted implicitly, a man whose family Elias had helped shelter and feed, secretly hoarded provisions, intending to flee with them. The betrayal cut deep, a raw wound in the heart of their nascent community. Elias felt the familiar sting of disillusionment, the old doubts whispering in his mind, questioning the inherent goodness he had begun to believe in. Yet his response was not one of anger or retribution. He confronted Silas, not with accusations, but with a quiet sorrow that spoke volumes. He listened to Silas's desperate pleas, his fear for his own children, and saw not just betrayal but the profound human struggle for survival in its rawest form. Instead of banishing him, Elias offered forgiveness, a gesture that stunned both Silas and the rest of the community. He redistributed Silas's hoarded supplies fairly among all, ensuring that no one, not even the betrayer, was left to starve. This act, born of a genuine understanding that true strength came not from vengeance, but from compassion and a deep reliance on a higher power, solidified his position as a true leader, demonstrating the profound resilience of a spirit anchored in faith. He understood that while human nature could be dark, the divine spark within each person, however obscured, could still be fanned into flame. Just as a semblance of order and hope began to take root, a new, far more significant threat emerged. Scouts returned with grim news. A large, organized band of scavengers, notorious for their brutality and ruthlessness, was moving towards their settlement. Their fragile progress, their painstakingly built community, now stood on the precipice of obliteration. The air crackled with a renewed sense of fear, a palpable dread that threatened to consume the nascent hope they had so carefully nurtured. This impending danger jeopardized everything Elias and the community had worked so hard to build, pushing their faith and resilience to their absolute limit. The news of the approaching raiders plunged the community into a state of panic, far deeper than any they had experienced since the initial collapse. This wasn't the impersonal threat of a ruined world, or the internal strife of human weakness. This was a direct, malevolent force intent on seizing what little they possessed, and likely their lives. Fear, cold and sharp, gripped every heart, threatening to shatter the fragile bonds Elias had so carefully forged. Whispers of surrender, of scattering into the wilderness, began to circulate, each word a venomous dart aimed at their collective resolve. Elias, though outwardly calm, felt the immense weight of their collective despair pressing down on him. He knew this was their ultimate test, a trial that would either forge them into something stronger or break them entirely. The decision before him was agonizing: fight against overwhelming odds or abandon their sanctuary and scatter, effectively dissolving the community they had painstakingly built. Every rational instinct screamed for retreat, for self-preservation, but something deeper, a quiet conviction born of his rediscovered faith, urged him to stand firm. He gathered the community, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, his eyes reflecting a profound yet resolute sorrow. "We have built this place not just with wood and stone, but with hope and trust," Elias declared, his gaze sweeping over the anxious faces. "To abandon it now is to abandon everything we have become. I believe we are meant for more than just survival. We are meant to thrive, to rebuild, to show that even in desolation, goodness can endure." He spoke not of victory, but of conviction, of holding fast to their principles even in the face of annihilation. He proposed a plan, audacious and perilous, one that relied less on their meager weapons and more on ingenuity, unity, and an unwavering belief in a higher power. It was a gamble, a desperate plea to the unseen hand that had guided him thus far. His plan involved fortifying their defenses, creating diversions and preparing for a stand, however brief. But more than that, it required every person to commit, to face their fear and transform it into resolve. There were dissenters, voices of doubt and despair, but Elias met them with patience and unwavering faith, not forcing, but inviting them to trust. He spent hours in prayer, not for a miraculous escape, but for strength, for wisdom, and for the courage to face whatever lay ahead. He knew that his actions now were a direct manifestation of his deep trust in God, a public declaration of his faith that would either be vindicated or shattered before the eyes of his community. As the raiders approached, a dark cloud on the horizon, The air grew heavy with anticipation. The community, though terrified, positioned themselves according to Elias's plan. Children were hidden, the elderly brought to the safest shelters, and every able-bodied person took their designated place. Elias stood at the forefront, not with a weapon in his hand, but with a quiet strength in his eyes, a tangible aura of peace amidst the gathering storm. He offered a silent, desperate prayer for deliverance, not just for their lives, but for their souls, for the continued flickering flame of hope they represented. The clash was brutal, a cacophony of shouts, clanging metal, and desperate cries. The raiders, confident in their numbers and ferocity, surged forward, expecting an easy victory. But they met an unexpected resistance, a community fighting not just for survival, but for a sacred ideal. Elias moved among them, a calming presence, offering encouragement, reminding them of their shared purpose. Just as their defenses seemed on the verge of collapsing, a series of events unfolded that defied all explanation. A sudden, violent sandstorm, unprecedented in its fury, erupted from the west, blinding the raiders, throwing their organized assault into chaos. Simultaneously, the primitive but effective traps Elias had designed, triggered by the unexpected weather, sprang to life, further disorienting the attackers. Then, from the very ruins they had once feared, a pack of wild dogs, drawn by the commotion, descended upon the scattered raiders, their primal ferocity adding to the pandemonium. The raiders, superstitious and unprepared for such a confluence of misfortunes, believed themselves cursed, their morale breaking as swiftly as it had been formed. They retreated in disarray, leaving behind their dead and wounded, their formidable threat dissolved by an unseen hand. The community watched in stunned silence as the storm subsided. The dogs vanished and the last of the raiders disappeared over the horizon. It was a miraculous intervention, an unexpected turn of events that saved their community, a direct and undeniable testament to Elias's unwavering faith. The immediate aftermath of the climactic event left the community in a state of stunned disbelief, a quiet awe replacing the recent terror. Dust motes danced in the pale morning light, illuminating the debris of battle, the scattered weapons, and the tracks of a hasty retreat. Elias, though physically exhausted, felt a profound lightness in his spirit. He bore the marks of the struggle, bruises on his arms, dirt streaking his face, but these were badges of a victory far greater than mere survival. He was not unscathed, but he was victorious in spirit, his faith not just reaffirmed but forged anew in the crucible of absolute peril. The community, once a collection of disparate, fearful individuals, began the long process of true rebuilding, their foundation now firmly rooted in a shared experience of divine intervention and Elias's unwavering trust. They cleared the battlefield, tended to their wounded, and with a newfound reverence buried the few who had fallen. There was no triumphalism, only a deep, abiding gratitude. Conversations were hushed, tinged with wonder, as each person recounted their perspective of the impossible storm, the perfectly timed traps, the sudden, wild protectors. Elias listened, his heart swelling with a quiet joy, knowing that these shared stories were weaving a new tapestry of belief, stronger than any physical wall. Elias often found himself standing at the edge of their rebuilt settlement, gazing towards the horizon, reflecting on his arduous journey. He remembered the initial shock of the collapse, the despair that had threatened to consume him, the agonizing questions he had hurled into the silent void. He recalled the fragile whispers of faith that had first stirred within him, seemingly irrational in a world stripped bare of meaning. Now that whisper had become a resounding chorus, a testament to an unwavering trust that had, against all odds, brought them through. The world was still broken, scarred by the catastrophe, but his heart was whole, overflowing with an unshakable peace that transcended the physical devastation. He found a new purpose, a calling that resonated deeply within his soul, guiding and inspiring others. He didn't preach from a pulpit. Instead, he led by example, his actions speaking volumes. He taught them not just how to cultivate the land and fortify their homes, but how to cultivate their spirits, how to find strength in vulnerability, and how to see the divine hand in the smallest mercies. He shared stories of his own struggles, his doubts, and his ultimate surrender, allowing others to see their own journeys reflected in his. The legacy of his faith began to spread, creating a ripple effect of hope that extended beyond their immediate settlement. Traders who passed through carried tales of the resilient community, of the man whose trust in something greater than himself had delivered them from destruction. Other scattered groups of survivors, hearing these stories, sought them out, drawn by the promise of not just safety, but of meaning. Elias welcomed them all, understanding that the true rebuilding of humanity began not with bricks and mortar, but with renewed spirits and shared belief. A final, powerful image often settled in the minds of those who witnessed Elias in these new days. He would stand, sometimes alone, sometimes with a few children gathered around him, looking out at the vast, desolate landscape. His gaze was not one of fear or longing for what was lost, but one of quiet confidence, a serene acceptance of the present, and a hopeful anticipation of the future. He understood, with every fiber of his being, that while the world might collapse into ruin, faith remained. It was the bedrock, the unshakable foundation upon which all true redemption would be built, a beacon in the perpetual twilight, guiding humanity towards a dawn where trust, not fear, would light the way. Light.